For over 50 years, nobody's been more than a few hundred miles away from Earth. We have taken a few steps since the first moon landings, built space stations, created reusable rockets, and we have more launch vehicles than ever, and there's been at least one person at space at all times for many years. But we can't be confined to low Earth orbit forever. With the United States, China, India, and dozens of companies across the world making advancements every day, it's clear we're on the verge of something big. Our ascension into space has begun, and it has already brought direct and substantial benefits to the people of Earth. But we must go further. And there's only one place in the entire universe that can fuel our journey to the rest of the solar system and to the stars. It's a place often overlooked in science fiction, constantly visible in our sky. The Moon. The Moon is not a boring dead rock in a high Earth orbit we can easily ignore. It's an entire untapped world. The Moon has mountains, it has valleys, it has a horizon. You can look up on the Moon and see Earth in the sky in just the same way you can stand on Earth and see the Moon. It's a world just as rich and diverse as any planet ever could be. It's an utter tragedy how much the Moon has been ignored. Most people, if they think about colonizing the Moon at all, only see it as a temporary stopping point on our way to Mars. I cannot express the damage this mindset has done to our ascent to space. The Moon is more than a stepping stone. It's more than a gas station. It is a place to build homes and build cities, and the first place to build humanity's empire among the stars. If we want a future among the stars, we must go to the Moon. This video will serve as a case for colonizing the Moon. Why we should do it, how it will benefit you, and how the evolving second space race will change humanity forever. But one thing is clear. We must go back. We can't afford to wait any longer.
I'm at the foot of the ladder. The 11-foot beds are only...
The Moon is the only world in the universe besides Earth that has ever had humans walk on it, and it was the greatest achievement of all mankind since the Industrial Revolution. The United States gave itself a decade to put people on the Moon, and we did it. The moon landing was the crowning achievement of the 20th century for all mankind, not just the United States. This was a sentiment seen around the world at the time. We have not been back since. The reasons for this are complicated. The Apollo program ultimately had one goal: beat the USSR to the Moon. Once that goal was accomplished, the US government, and more importantly, the American public, saw no point in continuing missions to the Moon. We did not lose the technology or capability to get to the Moon. We lost our ambition. This is one of the worst failures of humanity in modern times, and maybe in all of history. We haven't gone back to the Moon in over half a century, not because of any technological limitation, but because we haven't tried.
You're one of the very, very few people, I think, whose opinion on this is really worth having. In fact, there are only 4 of you. Do you think, from your knowledge of the Moon, having been there, that it is going to be possible in the foreseeable future to set up scientific bases there on anything like a large scale?
Oh, I'm quite certain that we'll have such bases in our lifetime.
That was Neil Armstrong saying he expects to have moon bases exist within his lifetime. He died in 2012. Humanity has failed the first person to ever walk on the Moon. There is no reason we can't build a moon base today. There is no technology holding us back. There is no obstacle that hasn't already been solved or is actively being worked on. The only reason we don't have a moon base today is because we've forgotten our ambition. It has been 50 years since any human has left low Earth orbit. 50 years. Human beings walked on the surface of another world in the 1960s, and the people at the time decided that was enough. During the Apollo program, all of the United States united to achieve this impossible goal. Never before has any country in history been so single-mindedly focused on a project like this, and no country has ever done it again. There are massive issues in the United States and across the world today. There is no denying that. The world we're in today is in a transition period of massive change, and we don't know what's going to be on the other side. This is one argument people use to justify not colonizing space, that we have problems on Earth. And yes, we have problems on Earth. Colonizing the Moon will help fix them, as I'll explain later, but this was happening in the 60s as well. During the time of the Apollo program, nuclear annihilation was a constant threat. The United States was involved in wars that seemed to have no end. People were finally getting their long-deserved equal rights, and there were people fighting back against them. Doesn't this sound familiar? This is exactly what's happening in the world today. The US is in a new Cold War with Russia and China. We're involved in conflicts across the globe: Israel and Palestine, Ukraine. There are huge political divisions, and oppressed groups are once again speaking up. Many people think the US has lost its superpower status, that we're headed toward collapse, and maybe we are. But people in the 60s thought that as well, and we chose to go to the Moon in spite of all of it. We stared down the barrel of mutually assured destruction and still found it within ourselves to strive for a higher goal. To realize that when we all work together, we can put human beings on the surface of another world. It's been 50 years since the departure of Apollo 17, the last crewed moon mission. We have not been back since. We haven't been back not because of any technological limitation, not because of any problem we haven't solved already. We have crossed the Van Allen belts, we have strapped people to one of the most powerful non-nuclear bombs ever conceived, and we already know how to use it to reach the worlds beyond Earth. We haven't gone back because we haven't tried. In the words of Gene Cernan, one of the last people on the moon,
Houston, before we close out our EVA, we understand that there are young people in Houston today who have been effectively touring our country, young people from countries all over the world, effectively touring our country, had the opportunity to watch the launch of Apollo 17, hopefully had an opportunity to meet some of our young people in our country, and we'd like to say, first of all, welcome, and we hope you enjoyed your stay. Second of all, I think probably one of the most significant things we can think about when we think about Apollo is that it has opened for us being the world, a challenge of the future. The door is now cracked, but the promise of that future lies in the young people, not just in America, but the young people all over the world, learning to live and learning to work together.
the United States and the rest of the world must remember how to strive for goals like this. No problem we face today is unsolvable. We can unite and we can still achieve great things. The people who put us on the moon the first time had all the same flaws and arrogance and hopes and dreams as we do today. They faced all the same problems we do now, and they did it anyway. The original engineers and scientists of the Apollo days are gone. They're retired or dead. We've waited too long for them. We must relearn how to get to the moon. But if they could do it, then so can we. We can return, and we must return.
And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
The moon is isolated, far away, and inhospitable. It's the harshest environment humanity has ever had to deal with, and the hardest we ever will have to deal with for a very long time. Why should we be wasting all this money on sending people to a dead world, especially when Earth has so many problems to fix? What's the point of all of this? These are valid questions. I feel like a lot of people in charge of space exploration ignore them, but we shouldn't. We need to ask what the value of space colonization is to people on Earth. The point is not scientific value. We get that by sending robots. It's also not for some vague humans are curious, we should go because it's interesting. That's not a practical reason to spend hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars. Luckily, these are not the reasons we need to go back to the moon. Returning to the moon will bring direct, noticeable benefits to the average person on Earth. Building a moon base isn't the pipe dream of a billionaire a century away. It is something we can do now, something that will be profitable and make life better on Earth. A moon base is in your best interest to support, no matter what your political beliefs are. The moon will fuel everything we will ever do in space. Rocket launches today cost millions of dollars, even with new technologies like Starship or the Falcon 9. The main reason for this is Earth's high gravity and atmosphere. Rockets not only must be aerodynamic, reducing their payload capacity significantly, but have to overpower the gravity of an entire planet. These problems are non-existent on the moon. This is a map of the solar system in terms of delta V. Delta V is, to put it very simply, the amount of speed you need to reach a certain object or orbit. You need to reach speeds of 9.4 kilometers a second to get to low Earth orbit if you're launching from Earth. That's why rockets need to be so big. Most of a rocket is just fuel to get the payload moving to speeds that are over 10 times faster than a bullet. Now look at the moon. To get to low Earth orbit, if you were launching from the moon, you only need 5.6 kilometers per second of delta V. This simple fact is what will propel the moon to become the industrial capital of the solar system. It is easier to get to low Earth orbit if you start on the moon than if you launch from the exact same rocket from Earth. You can carry larger payloads if you start on the moon. You don't have to make your rockets aerodynamic. It is faster, cheaper, and more efficient to launch rockets from the moon than to launch rockets from Earth. If we want a future in space, we must return to the moon. Getting to Mars depends on the moon. Asteroid mining depends on the moon. Everything we will ever want to do in space for thousands of years to come depends on the moon. All because we can build truly gigantic and powerful rockets there, ones we can't build on Earth. Humanity simply will not have a future in space if we do not build rockets on the moon. Launching rockets from Earth is just too difficult and expensive for the projects we want to do. Truly massive space colonization projects only become possible if we start on the moon. But why does any of this matter? Who cares about Mars or asteroids when there are problems on Earth? Well, the moon will help with that as well. Material mined from the moon can be shipped back to Earth extremely easily. Not as easily as mining it from Earth, but doesn't need to be. Raw materials don't expire, so it doesn't matter how long it takes for them to reach their destination. As long as mining the moon can be done and the material can be shipped to Earth cheaply, then that's the basis for an economy. We could eliminate some Earth-based mining, which ruins the environment. But that's not the only way that colonizing the moon could actually help stop climate change. There's also space-based solar power. Solar power is more efficient in space because there's no atmosphere in the way. Launching gigantic solar panels from the moon could be economically viable, giving humanity huge quantities of energy to use. NASA recently made a study about space-based solar and found it to not be economically viable, the main reason being the enormous launch costs from Earth. Guess which world doesn't have enormous launch costs? The only initial cost is building up infrastructure. The moon has all the raw materials we need to build solar panels. Not only is space-based solar better for the environment, but it's also simply incredibly efficient. With space-based solar, we could get more cheap electricity. The initial cost will, again, be expensive, but the long-term benefits we'll get from this will far exceed the short-term costs. And space-based solar power is only viable when it's done by launching the panels from the moon. Or we could also turn these orbital panels into shades, blocking small amounts of sunlight by putting them at Earth's L1 Lagrange point. Blocking out small amounts of sunlight won't affect the ecosystems, especially if we only block certain wavelengths, but they will ever so slightly cool Earth down. This will give us vital extra time to figure out a better solution for climate change, and it's easier to do this by launching orbital shades from the moon. And if we ever figure out nuclear fusion, we could use the moon's helium-3 to power it. The moon has almost no helium-3. It's the equivalent of a lunar fossil fuel reserve, but it will be a start. And, of course, the moon will get us to the rest of the solar system because of the sheer ease of launching a rocket from the moon. But that just moves the question back further. We want to go to the moon because we want to develop space. But then what's the point of developing space? But that just moves the question back further. We want to go to the moon because we want to develop space. But what's the point of developing space? Obviously, there's space-based solar and lunar mining, which will give us huge amounts of raw materials and power, but there's a lot more. Infrastructure in low Earth orbit is going to be critical to countries and companies in the 21st century. Multiple technologies we use today depend on space. Satellites giving us the internet and GPS are an obvious example of this, but it goes much, much further. On February 21st, 2024, the company Varda Space successfully completed the first ever uncrewed re-entry of a private space mission. Inside the capsule returned to Earth were pharmaceuticals produced in space. Certain types of medicine are more effective when they are made in space. The lack of gravity eliminates imperfections they would otherwise have when made on Earth. And medicine isn't the only one. Fiber optic cables, which are needed to make the internet run, perform better when made in space. This was tested on the International Space Station already. Fiber optics produced in space are faster than the ones made on Earth. If we start producing fiber optics in space, then we could drastically speed up the internet. 3D printing human organs could also be more effective in space. The organs won't collapse when there's no gravity, leading to higher quality organs less likely to be rejected by the body during a transplant, eliminating a lot of the danger that comes with organ transplants. Space development is not a matter of prestige. It's not only for some scientists with too much taxpayer money on their hands to do experiments that in the long run won't benefit you. Space manufacturing and orbital factories can and will save lives. This isn't even mentioning the huge improvements in agriculture and disaster relief that space development has already made possible. The constant satellite monitoring of our planet has already greatly increased crop yields and aided in preventing the negative effects of natural disasters. There are already practical reasons to keep investing in space, and these reasons will only grow as time goes on. And all this costs the average American less than 1% of their taxes. And, of course, there's the military aspect to all of this. On October 31st, 2023, a Houthi ballistic missile from Yemen was launched toward Israel. Israel successfully shot down this missile, but when they did so, it was above Earth's atmosphere in space. This marks the first ever instance of combat in space ever. Space warfare will only grow from here. The US, China, and Russia have all tested anti-satellite weaponry capable of shooting down satellites from orbit. These countries all have satellites in orbit specifically for watching nuclear launches. If these satellites are shot down, then whatever country using them will have their abilities to detect an inbound nuclear attack significantly limited. Space is already a critical part of the modern military landscape. Space warfare is not something in science fiction. It is already happening. and as more space infrastructure is built, it will only get more important. Space has been at the forefront of the military for years now. Space development is the reason we can gather intelligence on other countries, how we can detect inbound attacks, nuclear or conventional. Space infrastructure is already critical to the defense of several countries. Space development will not only benefit people on Earth in times of peace, but keep your home country safe in times of war. And all forms of space development are easier to do when built on the moon. Rockets launched from the moon can put far bigger payloads in Earth orbit than a launch from Earth. From the moon, we could launch entire space stations in single launches, build whole factories in months when it would take years on Earth, put hundreds upon hundreds of tons of materials into orbit in a fraction of the time and cost. Developing the moon and developing space are intrinsically linked to one another. If we do not develop the moon, we won't have a future in space, ever. No near-term future advancements like orbital factories, military installations, and space tourism, and no far future stuff like Mars colonies, voyages to other stars, terraforming, Dyson swarms, none of it. Every minute we waste not getting colonies up and running on the moon is throwing away our future. We have to stop trying to get colonies on Mars and focus back on the moon. Humanity's future depends on it. Elon Musk is trying to build a city on Mars, and thousands of people truly believe that Mars is our future. It isn't. Before I start this section of the video, I should mention a few things. I don't like Elon Musk as a person, but SpaceX is an incredible company. They pioneered the first truly reusable rockets. Their ships are going to take people back to the moon this decade. I am not a SpaceX hater. It's undeniable that they've done incredible things, and they have routinely proved the people who doubted them wrong over and over. I absolutely want SpaceX to succeed, but I'm scared they're going to waste this incredible potential on trying to build a colony on Mars. I also think that we should send humans to Mars, just for how inspiring and monumental an achievement like that would be. But sending humans to Mars and creating a colony on Mars are two very different things. Mars in the near term has nothing of value for humanity. It's as simple as that. It's a resource-poor radioactive dirtball 200 million miles away. To be clear, before a bunch of SpaceX fans click off, being anti-Mars colonization and being anti-space colonization are two different things. I am not being a pessimist who wants humanity to die on Earth by pointing out that we need to focus on the moon before Mars. I feel that fans of Mars colonization tend to group everyone who's anti-Mars in a single group, that they're all a bunch of space colonization haters. I should know, when I first started getting interested in space colonization, I was one of them. But I ask you to just ignore that bias for a second and hear me out. Humanity can have a future in space without Mars. Space colonization must be profitable and beneficial to people on Earth. We've already seen what happens when people stop seeing the point in going to space. The Apollo program is cancelled and we don't leave Earth orbit for over 50 years. The idea of colonizing Mars is bringing us down the same path as the Apollo program. They're both projects for prestige. No matter how many people say colonizing Mars will be good for all humanity, the current Mars colonization projects are first and foremost so the people who are doing them can get their names in history. I want a future in space. I think I've made that abundantly clear at this point. I don't want to wait decades as projects are cancelled and they go billions of dollars over budget. SpaceX and NASA work so close together at this point that if one fails, the other goes with it. Prestige projects like this that don't benefit people on Earth will drag space colonization down and kill the momentum we have. Once again, I am not a SpaceX hater. I'm not attacking them just because Elon Musk is in charge. SpaceX has been a major positive for the entire space industry, but they are not perfect. Just because I'm calling out their flaws doesn't mean I hate them. I'm saying all this because I want SpaceX to succeed. I don't want us to spend all of our money on a Mars colony that won't bring any benefits to Earth. Just because I'm saying something negative doesn't mean I'm a pessimist. I like to consider myself very optimistic when it comes to space colonization. Colonizing Mars is completely possible. That's not the problem. Lunar development is just the only space colonization project we should be targeting right now, since it's the only one that will give us near-term benefits that will change humanity for the better. Its benefits are enormous and will give us the other planets. Mars has nothing to offer humanity. Not right now. We can get raw materials and living space on the moon. It's too expensive to get them from Mars. Colonizing Mars won't protect us from extinction. Building moon colonies will do that for us. If there is ever a disaster scenario on Earth, then the goal for other colonies in the solar system isn't to survive for the long term. The goal is to get back to Earth as fast as possible to rebuild, and the moon is simply better at that than Mars because it's closer. Mars is not a good place to terraform, and that would take thousands of years and quadrillions of dollars anyway. If Mars was as close as us to the moon, this would be a different story, but it isn't. It's over 200 million miles away. Too far away to give anything beneficial to humanity. What happens when we start spending taxpayer money on building Mars colonies? Yes, SpaceX is a private company, but right now, their biggest customer is NASA. NASA will want a hand in colonizing Mars. Once people realize there's no benefits in doing this, and the prestige of going to Mars has worn off, people will begin to ask why they're paying for this. And as soon as people start wondering that, space exploration dies. SpaceX is trying to further humanity, but right now they have the potential to go down the same route of Apollo, a program that flew too close to the sun. A few successful missions and then cancellations and failed dreams for decades. The current momentum SpaceX has could die at any time. We saw it with Apollo, and we could see it again. If you are a fan of colonizing Mars, I just want you to listen to me. Everything I just said may sound pessimistic, or that I'm just being a hater for no reason. I still get comments saying stuff like that. I am not a pessimist, and I very much want space colonization to happen. I like space exploration just as much as you do. We both want a future in space. But I'm not willing to let people waste tens of billions of dollars on missions that won't benefit Earth and kill space exploration as we know it. If we go straight to Mars without going to the moon first, I genuinely think space colonization will die. It happened with the Apollo program, and it will happen again. Of course, SpaceX and NASA aren't the same thing. SpaceX gets money from Starlink, for example, that could fund at least part of a Mars colony. But SpaceX works incredibly closely with NASA. Even if SpaceX doesn't face the problems I'm talking about, NASA will, and that will seriously mess up the space industry. Elon Musk fans like to say NASA is lagging behind and SpaceX is the future, but SpaceX relies on NASA. NASA is their largest customer by far and pays for a lot of their projects. We cannot ignore the moon, the only other world in the solar system that could create profitable colonies. The moon is a world just as interesting as Mars. It's time to forget Mars. Not forever, just for now. I'm saying that as a person who truly wants to see a future among the stars. Colonizing the moon instead of Mars is not a step backwards. It is a gigantic leap forwards that will fuel our ascension to other planets. A lot of the reason the billionaires want to go to Mars is to get their names in the history books. But they'll still do that if they go for the moon instead. There will come a day when there are cities on Mars. It's just not going to be soon. Our generation will be known for building cities on the moon. And is that not just as good? We're still going to be putting permanent populations on another world. This will still make us a multi-world species. It will have the same amount of prestige. History books will still look back on us as the first people to actually do space colonization. If you want a future in space, then you must support developing the moon, not Mars. We will one day have both, but that time is not today. Our generation will pave the way for further space colonization by going to the moon. If you still aren't convinced, I go much more in depth about why colonizing Mars is a bad idea in my video specifically about that topic, which is linked in the top corner of this video. I skipped over a lot of the details about why colonizing Mars is a bad idea here, because this video is about the moon, not Mars. My other video explains this much better. Lunar development is expensive. It will take a long time, but the benefits of doing so are unimaginable. And it's not just the United States that knows this. The United States has been the undisputed superpower in space for years now. India has yet to launch humans into space, though is making significant progress. Russia is a declining space power. North Korea's rockets keep blowing up. But China is beginning to seriously compete. The Chinese space program is second to only the United States. They have a robust human spaceflight program. They've sent rovers to Mars. As of the time I'm writing this video, they are about to become the first country in history to return samples from the far side of the moon, the side that doesn't face Earth. China has a whole space station, Tiangong, which is 1/3 the size of the ISS. That may not sound like a lot, but the ISS took the combined efforts of 15 countries over decades to complete. China built Tiangong Station by themselves in a fraction of the time. China is trying to beat the United States and become the new dominant space power. The United States is not taking it seriously enough, and if we do not act fast, this could have drastic consequences. China has publicly and officially stated that they want to put humans on the moon before 2030. That's not a rumor, that is a direct official statement from the government. China's space program is incredibly secretive. They don't even announce the crew of missions until after they've already launched. China cancels entire projects in secret so people only see the good parts of their space program. If China says they want to put humans on the moon by 2030, then based on how they've operated their space program so far, that's not just propaganda. That means they actually believe they can do it. And why wouldn't they? China's been successfully landing mission after mission on the moon. Chang'e 3, their first successful robotic lunar landing, was in 2013. Then came Chang'e 4, the first ever soft landing on the far side of the moon in history. Then Chang'e 5, China's first lunar sample return, and now Chang'e 6, the first sample return from the far side. The US hasn't successfully landed anything on the moon in 50 years. Peregrine 1 burned up in Earth's atmosphere. IM-1, while it did survive and land on the moon, fell over and failed to accomplish many mission goals. And it's not just the US that's falling behind. Israel's Beresheet lander crash landed in 2019. India's Chandrayaan-3 was successful, but Chandrayaan-2 also crashed. Japan's Slim lander, while it did somehow manage to survive over 3 lunar nights when it wasn't expected to survive one, landed on its side. China is miles ahead of everyone in terms of lunar landings right now, and nobody is taking it seriously. And China's plans are only going to get more ambitious from here. Chang'e 7 is set to land at Shackleton Crater in 2026, as in the Shackleton Crater that almost certainly has water ice needed for a lunar base. The IM-2 American mission is also targeting a landing there in 2024, but given how China has been succeeding so far while American missions have fallen behind, there's a chance they successfully land at Shackleton first. This is a big deal. Shackleton Crater is currently the most strategically important location on the entire moon. Shackleton Crater is most likely where NASA's Artemis 3 astronauts are going to land, the first humans back on the moon in 50 years, potentially as early as 2026. Both the US and China are targeting it for both robotic and crewed missions. But why? Because Shackleton Crater has everything we need for a lunar base. It has water ice in the crater basin, constant sunlight on the crater rim for solar power, easy places to dig into the rocks and protect yourself from radiation, constant communication with Earth. When we begin building bases on the moon, Shackleton is where we will go first. Right now, we are in a space race. We aren't about to be in one is not beginning, we are already in the middle of it. The difference is, the US public doesn't even know it's competing. China is taking this space race extremely seriously, and the US population doesn't even know it's happening. This is a bad combination. If things keep going as they currently are, then China is going to beat the US to the moon. But why is this bad? Can't we just cooperate? Well, first off, we legally can't. The Wolf Amendment is a part of US law that prohibits NASA from working with China in space. That's the reason China isn't part of the International Space Station. They legally aren't allowed to be. Second, China has repeatedly shown itself to be aggressive when it comes to claiming territory. It has border disputes with half the countries it borders, and it routinely redraws internationally recognized boundaries to suit its own needs. What will happen if they do this on the moon? What if they claim Shackleton Crater as sovereign Chinese territory? Of course, we have the Outer Space Treaty to prevent this. The OST says that no country can claim the moon or any other space object for themselves. But I would bet a lot of money that the Outer Space Treaty is not going to be followed or even matter at all when it comes to this space race. The OST was never supposed to be permanent law. It was always meant to be a placeholder until proper space regulation could be put in place. Problem is, space development slowed down significantly, likely in part because of the treaty's overly harsh restrictions, and we got stuck with it. I'm very confident that the Outer Space Treaty will either be significantly revised or outright removed from international law by the 2040s. The regulations we have now, with no country allowed to claim space objects for themselves or put nuclear weapons in space, probably aren't going to be around forever. They'll probably still exist in some capacity, but not like they are today. The OST is old and outdated, and new space law will have to take its place soon. This all may sound dramatic, but I honestly believe it, given how seriously China is taking the space race. They want a moon base. They have plans to build a moon base. The entire Chang'e program, from the first landing to the upcoming landing at Shackleton Crater, has been in preparation to build a moon base. I'm saying China will probably try to gain influence over the moon because they already are. I don't want to sound like I'm fear-mongering here, I obviously can't predict the future, but this is a possibility we have to take seriously. It's not like the US is innocent either. We'll probably be trying the same tactics to limit China. We are in a space race after all. But right now, we are behind. It would be nice if we could all cooperate and go to the moon in peace for all mankind. And there are ways we can cooperate. I'm not saying that China or the US will definitely try to claim the moon for themselves. It could very well be much more peaceful. But that's not guaranteed, and we have to accept that. We can't just sit around and wait for world peace to do space colonization. Space colonization will have cooperation, but also competition and people trying to gain profit. Unfortunately, in the system we have now, competition drives innovation. We saw it with everything from the first space race to the world wars. This won't go away for a very long time, if ever. Conflict drives development. As long as we don't go overboard, competition will make space colonization happen faster, not cooperation. We might as well work within the system we already have, or else nothing's going to be done. China has detailed plans for the construction of a moon base. The upcoming Chang'e 8 mission will try making bricks on the moon. They have international partners and a plan for how to construct a base in multiple phases. The United States currently has no plans like this. Sure, we have the Viper rover that will try to search for water on the South Pole. We have the Artemis program that aims to send humans back to the moon in 2026. We have Starship, the most powerful rocket ever invented. But after sending humans to the moon, we have no idea what to do next. We have no plans for the construction of a permanent lunar base. We know what we're going to do in the short term, but not the long term. China has both short-term and long-term plans for the construction of a moon base, which they have already started with the Chang'e program. There is a real chance that China will get the first moon base, even with the US's technological advantage. We need to figure out how to build a moon base.
Orion continues to grow closer to the moon. We are now only 7,166 miles away. That's a change.
The first steps of building a moon base will make or break the entire program. If we fail to find easily accessible water ice within the next few years, for example, it could delay our plans by decades. When we return to the moon this decade, we have to do so in a big way. The United States is already building the modules for Gateway Station in lunar orbit, the moon's first space station. If all goes according to the current schedules, then the first pieces of Gateway should be in orbit by 2027. Gateway Station is considered to be a waste of time by some, but it's a really important step in further lunar colonization. It gives astronauts access to the moon to remotely operate robots without actually having to go down to the surface, for example. It could hold cargo for future missions so we don't have to take it all from Earth. I've even seen studies that say Gateway could act as an early warning station for asteroids headed towards Earth. But the real goal of both the American and Chinese lunar programs are to build bases on the ground. Ground stations are much easier to expand. All the resources you need are right there. Lunar resources are going to be the most important part of building a base. We need oxygen, water, and building materials. Luckily, the moon has all of that. The moon's regolith is literally made of oxygen. The moon has enough oxygen to support billions of humans for hundreds of thousands of years, just in the top layers of rock alone. The moon also has all the same raw materials as Earth. We can make concrete out of lunar regolith, for example, or aluminum, and most importantly, steel. Not only that, but to get these materials, you need to melt down the regolith. That will release oxygen, which we can capture for the base. You can knock out two of the most important requirements, building material and oxygen, with just mining stations. The next most important thing is water, which the lunar South Pole does have. We currently don't know where the best places for mining it are, but that's where the upcoming missions to the lunar South Pole will be focusing on. IM-2 will drill for water ice, and the Viper rover in Chang'e 7 will actively search for it. After that, we need food and power. Power is simple enough. The rim of Shackleton gets near constant sunlight because of the moon's low axial tilt and the crater rim's high elevation, so it's perfect for solar power stations. Food is the most difficult aspect of all this. Lunar regolith is not good for farming. Plants simply don't grow well here. Maybe one day we'll figure out how to turn the electrically charged razor-sharp lunar regolith into usable soil, but for now we'll either need to import food from Earth or import soil to the moon. After that, we need to protect people from radiation. We can do that by burying our habitats in a bunch of dirt. That will block most of the harmful stuff. The low gravity is also a non-issue. One of the main reasons colonizing Mars is hard is because the travel times are long and you're stuck there for 2 years. The low gravity could significantly affect your health. The moon is right next to Earth. Crews can be regularly switched out, just like the ISS. The low gravity problem, as well as all the social and mental issues that come with being stuck in a cramped habitat for years, are completely avoided, because the crew doesn't have to be stuck there for years. A lot of the problems with building a moon base have already been thought about for decades, so there's already several good potential solutions for all of them. We also need to figure out how to build the base. There's multiple options. We could just build it like the ISS by making modules and sending them to the moon, but this is slow and inefficient. Building habitats out of lunar material is something we will eventually do, but not on the very first base. Luckily, at least with the Artemis program, we're already bringing a fully functional lunar habitat with us. Starship HLS. NASA has chosen SpaceX's Starship to land humans on the moon, and it is absolutely massive. The Starship Human Landing System, or Starship HLS, dwarfs everything we've ever put on the moon. This thing towers over the Apollo 11s. It's a skyscraper in its own right. This is the spacecraft that the Artemis astronauts will use to get to the moon. The lunar South Pole is very rugged terrain. There's almost no flat land. A thing as tall and thin as Starship HLS would be pretty easy to tip over. And once it's tipped over, we can hollow it out, remove the engines, the fuel tanks, and expand crew accommodations. We now have a fully functional lunar habitat made of a hollowed-out Starship. Out of all the proposals I've seen, this is by far the best and easiest method of making a quick lunar base to allow for further expansion. No unnecessary additional modules from Earth, no years of additional construction time. We need to cover the Starship in regolith to block radiation, but after that, the habitat will be pretty much done. This is something we can do in the next few years. And this is scalable. We can design Starships specifically to land on the moon, fall over, and become part of the growing lunar base. Once we have a large enough base to support a crew of a few dozen, then we can truly start expanding. Set up oxygen and water mining stations. We'll already have the heavy machinery there, because we need them to bury Starships with regolith. Starship is big enough to accommodate large-scale construction vehicles, so the industrialization of the moon will begin. Starship HLS should be fully operational within a few years from now, assuming everything goes according to plan, so the beginnings of our lunar base are only about a decade away. We can drill for water ice at the bottom of Shackleton Crater, set up mining stations in the CO2 cold traps of the nearby Faustini crater to gather carbon to make steel. We can begin manufacturing our own rocket fuel of hydrogen gathered from the water and oxygen from the rocks. Launching rockets is stupidly easy from the moon, as I've explained already. It will start with small-scale rockets made of lunar material, then bigger rockets, then satellites launched from the moon, then bigger satellites, then small-scale space stations and orbital factories, which will allow more people to travel to the moon, and they'll bring with them more equipment to expand the base, which will give us more materials to build bigger rockets, which means bigger space stations, bigger satellites, bigger orbital factories, space tourism, space hotels, military ships, nuclear rockets because the ships are getting so big conventional thrusters can't propel them. Space-based solar helps solve climate change, further space development solving further problems on Earth, alternate cyclers, the types of ships we'll need to expand to the rest of the solar system. The moon is a great place to get raw materials. As lunar travel becomes easier, maybe mining companies will move here. Lunar tourism, the more expansion of the base with more workers, even bigger rockets, titanic space stations, a thriving lunar economy will be built. We'll need lunar freighters to accommodate the growing population. Competition with China or other countries will drive innovation. New technologies will be invented. New medicines to treat the harsh effects of radiation. Maybe even cures for cancer, since radiation tends to cause cancer. Companies will move some assets to the moon. Billionaires will buy private housing. We'll need workers to run the hotels and the mining equipment. More workers means more expansion of the base. More orbital infrastructure to transfer more people. Before you know it, the moon is an industrial powerhouse, supplying Earth and the other planets of the solar system with huge amounts of raw materials, or with space stations and ships or military equipment. The moon will be a production hub for everything. There's no life to destroy with industry, no ecosystems to pollute, and there are no environmental regulations. Resources from the moon will propel humanity to the future. None of this is far future stuff. We can start all of this today, and I, for one, am done waiting. There is no reason we can't start the construction of a moon base now. It will be expensive initially, but the return on investment will be unfathomable. Whoever builds the first moon base will have a monopoly on the solar system. Mars, Venus, the asteroid belt, the outer planets. A global superpower spanning multiple globes. All the solar system can be ours, in ours and our children's lifetimes, if we just start colonizing the moon now. People describe the moon as a stepping stone to Mars. It's not. It's the place where we will build highways to connect the far corners of the solar system. And along the roads we will make on the moon, we will build homes, businesses, a whole new thriving world for humanity. We are a flawed species, but so were the people who got us to the moon in the first place. We can go back, we must go back. Not just to honor the legacy of those that came before us, not just to get to Mars, but to secure a future for all humanity. There will be conflict. We will probably fight wars over the moon, but it will be worth it. We cannot afford to wait any longer. The moon protects us from extinction just as well as Mars ever could. We have ignored the other world hanging in our sky for far too long. It's time to go back for all mankind. The future is not something we have to sit around and wait for. The more people that know the benefits of lunar development, the more people we'll have to convince governments and companies to actually start taking it seriously. We can make lunar development happen. It will define the 21st century, and we can be the ones who start it. Forget going down history as the time period that got people to Mars. Let's be known as the people who developed the moon, who gave the future humans the entire rest of the solar system. When historians look back on how space colonization started, they won't look at Mars, they'll look at the moon. It is where humanity's future among the stars will begin. All we have to do is return. Thank you for watching.